All right, if I could please have your attention. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask before I begin? Questions that might have arisen out of Sainath's talk, which you were not able to address to him since we didn't have enough time for discussion. But there are a few of you who had come for the evening lecture as well. So if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask before I begin about any of the matters that have been discussed up till this point in time in class. I also, yes, Dominic.
Do we use that website as like a source for the essays?
The website that he had, PARI, People's Archive of Rural India. You most certainly may. Yeah?
It's not live yet.
Huh?
It's not live.
Well, it's not live yet, but I think there are portions of it which are up there, if I'm not mistaken. So if you've tried to access it, I think that he had mentioned ruralindiaonline.org, something like that. I can't remember exactly, but if it's there, if there's material from there, I mean, it would be like using any other material, which I've mentioned to you in the class before, that if you wanted to use a website as part of the evidence for an argument that you're advancing in your paper, well, just give me the reference to the website, right? So it would be no different than using any other material, effectively. Yeah. Any other questions that anybody has? I did send you a list of questions by email, questions, prompts, suggestions, whatever you want to think of them as, and I think there's enough scope there to cover a huge number of topics. I mean, it seems to me inconceivable that you're not going to find something there of interest to you, but if you wanted to do a paper on something which is not mentioned over there, that's perfectly fine by me, just so long as it has some relationship to the course. I mean, somebody sent me an email and they said they would like to do a paper maybe on education, and I said that's perfectly fine. If you want to do a paper which looks at, for example, what has been India's record with respect to the question of education, you're most welcome to do a paper of that kind. And you could obviously use the Amartya Sen reading, but that would be only one of many kinds of readings that are available on that particular subject. All right, so the agenda for today, I'm going to first actually begin with something that's not on the board, and that's the Constitution, because I started talking about it exactly a week ago, and then of course in the previous class I couldn't take it up since we had a guest lecture there. I want to say a few more things about the Constitution, not very much, because I have talked a little bit about its background, but I want to begin with that, and then we're going to move on to the subjects that are on the board here, which are broadly all accommodated under the rubric of what we mean when we speak about development and well-being. There will be probably some continuation of this in the early part of next week, maybe the first 20-30 minutes. So we're pretty much still on schedule as far as the syllabus for this class is concerned, because there's obviously a great deal of detail in the Amartya Sen Jean Drèze book, for example, which I'm not going to cover here, such as the comparisons that he makes, and again I did speak about that as well, the comparisons that he makes between, for example, India and Bangladesh, or between India and Sub-Saharan Africa. What are the implications of such comparisons, and why is it that countries such as Bangladesh might have actually done better than India? But again, I think in passing we'll be able to comment on that once again. But let me begin very briefly with the Constitution. So recall what I'd said to you, that the Constitution is a document which was put together by the Constituent Assembly. Within the Constituent Assembly, which is a group of 300 odd men, largely upper caste, largely Brahmins. So these within the Constituent Assembly, they put together what is called the drafting committee of for the Constitution, and this drafting committee in fact studies the American Constitution, the Irish Constitution, a number of other documents in order to put together this vital document. And one of the questions that I think that we must perforce ask is what has a document, the Constitution, what has this document done for the people of India? What is a litmus test of a democracy? Okay, broaden it out. What is a litmus test of a democracy? So if you said, well, the litmus test of a democracy is that it should guarantee freedom and liberty to everyone, and we know that these are very subjective things. What do we mean by freedom? What do we mean by liberty? Right? And so Mohandas Gandhi the father of the nation, said that, well, there is a litmus test to a democracy. And the litmus test to a democracy is, how does it treat, number one, its minorities? How does it treat its minorities? And number two, how have the weakest sections of that society benefited from the Constitution and from the country being a democracy? Right? So that if you say that a country has been a democracy over a course of 5 decades or 100 years, in the case of the United States for 250 years, so how has the United States fared with respect to the question of treatment of its minorities? Why is it, for example, that most immigrant groups in the United States, within 2 to 3 generations, are able to lift themselves up, but that there's some that have not been able to do it? The Puerto Ricans being a very good example. Chronic problems of stagnation, underemployment, poverty. African American. I mean, there are 3 communities in the United States which, over a period of generations, have not been able to lift themselves up to the extent that one would have wanted. And that's Puerto Ricans, American Indians, and African Americans. Right? So you could say that, well, if that's a litmus test, then, well, then the US has failed as a democracy. And one could make that argument. Now, conceivably, I think in India, one made that argument. Clearly, India has failed as a democracy because it's done very poorly by the people who live at the bottom, exceedingly poorly. Right? And in fact, Arun Datti, who's of course a master of the English language, you read one of her essays, right? The Greater Common Good, a couple of weeks ago. She says, well, no, India is not an example of a failed state. It's actually been a very successful state because it's been eminently successful in exploiting all of its poorest people. If that's a definition of a state, well, then actually India has done really well, because those who are at the bottom, it continues to milk them, as much as it can. Right? So that's one way to look at it. But I want to, because you might say, well, that's a very political reading. So I think that the test that Gandhi put forward is, I think, actually a good test. That you judge a democracy by how it treats its minorities and how it treats its weakest sections of its society. And then the Constitution, of course, is the embodiment of that democracy, at least in principle, which is why it's important to look at how has the Constitution fared in India, what has it done for its people. It's done very well for people like Sainath and maybe for myself and many others, because we have the constitutional guarantees, and if somebody attempts to suppress these guarantees, that well, then you use the influence that you have to try to make sure that you have a voice, right? So because I remember there was a question in this class that was put to Sainath, and I think that question came from you, I think, if I remember correctly, but I think the question was, well, how, are you free to say all of this in India? And you're absolutely free to say it. I mean, this is not Saddam Hussein's Iraq that we're talking about here. Let's be very clear about that. So we have to understand that there are obviously very different classes. Now, one of the interesting problems, and we're going to get to that later on, if you notice this thing called the middle class, it's a problem that's quite common in social analysis. And for those of you who came both for the afternoon presentation by Sainath and especially for the evening one, if you think about it, one of the things that you will notice is that he speaks about the people who are at the very bottom and then the people who are at the very top. What about everyone who's in the middle? This is a very common problem in social theory. And that is that it's much easier to make certain kinds of arguments when you're speaking about the people at the extremities. How do you deal with the middle class? Right? And one of the things that's happened in India, certainly, as a consequence of the economic reforms and changes over a period of time, is the growth of what is called a middle class. And of course, we'll have to try to define what a middle class is. But before we do that, let's go back now again. Right? So we've got the Constitution, I've given you the background. What does the Constitution do? It gives certain fundamental rights to the people of India. Right? And remember that India is defined as a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic. The words socialist and secular were put into the Constitution much later on, into the preamble. They are not part of the original preamble to the Constitution. Right? Needed actually an amendment which was the 42nd Amendment in order to put these words into the preamble. Now, the fundamental rights are, of course, numerous, but the most important fundamental rights are, as you can imagine, what? The right to freedom of religion, cultural and educational rights, right to equality, right to freedom, right against exploitation. Okay? These are all enumerated as fundamental rights, rights to property. This is, by the way, subsequently going to be removed. And there's actually a considerable discussion about this. All right? And right to constitutional remedies, that in fact that if your other rights are being infringed, you actually have the right to, in fact, go to a court and to gain constitutional remedy for your grievances. If you have a just grievance, of course. You may not have a just grievance, right? So these are some of the fundamental rights that are guaranteed in the Constitution. Now the Indian Constitution has a feature which is peculiar to the Indian Constitution. You do not find it in the American Constitution or the Constitution of Australia, so forth and so on. And these is what are called directive principles of state policy. So what are the directive principles of state policy? These are guidelines for the framing of laws by the government. So the directive principle of state policy, if it's a guideline, would be that, well, that when the Indian government passes a law, it should not pass a law that infringes upon, okay, the rights of people in various kinds of domains. Okay? Now the directive principles are not enforceable in a court. Fundamental rights are enforceable. So you have the fundamental right, for example, to your own life, right? And that's the right to habeas corpus. And its direct legal manifestation in most countries, including the United States, is that, for example, when you're put in prison, right? So the right to habeas corpus means what? It means effectively that when you're put in prison, well, that you have a right to be produced before a judge or a magistrate, right? And that you cannot be put in prison unless specific charges are levied against you. And of course, there are ways in which the state tends to circumvent all of these rights constantly. So for example, in the United States, they have been circumvented in the last 15 years, particularly in the last 15 years since the attacks of September 11th, because the state claims national interest and national security is paramount. So if a certain person is perceived to be dangerous or a threat to the state, what do? You lock that person up. What is Guantanamo all about? Guantanamo is exactly about that. The fact that you lose your right to your own life. That you don't have to be produced before, you could be locked away for 10 years and you don't have a right to appear before a judge. And that's a violation of the Constitution. So what the directive principles of state policy do is they provide guidelines to the state to ensure, but again this is all in principle, to ensure that these fundamental rights are not abrogated. Okay? But as I said, within each legal system, including the system of India, there is a constant attempt by the state to circumvent these rights. In India, for example, one of the major ways in which these rights are sought to be circumvented by the state is through what is called POTA, okay, which is Prevention of Terrorism Act. Right? And in many states of India, they have found, the human rights activists, that POTA is routinely used, regularly used, to lock up labor union activists. Right? Well, they have nothing to do with terrorism. But you see, if you put into prison a person who is a labor union activist, organizer, labor union organizer, well, then that person can actually say that, well, you know, look, you put me in jail, you don't really have any evidence, right? And so he or she would then go to the courts. When you put that person in prison under POTA, it exempts the state from having to produce that person before a judge. And this is something that, as I said, you're going to find in all democracies. All democracies, to larger or smaller measure, are going to use acts of legislation of this kind. But in principle, the Constitution of India is very clear that you have these kinds of fundamental rights, right? And then in addition to that, you have these directive principles of state policies, which are meant to provide guidelines to the state to ensure that these rights are not, in fact, actually abrogated. Right? That's, I think, the nutshell of what you need to know about the Constitution to help you think about, all right, how has India done as a democracy in political terms, in economic terms? Right? And Gandhi was very clear that after the attainment of independence, one of the last things he writes, a few days before his death, he writes something like what we might call a last will and testament. I mean, if we want to broadly use that phrase. And what he writes is that, look, we have attained political independence in India, but now we have a much more difficult task ahead of us. And that difficult task is ensuring the social, economic, cultural rights of people. Okay? Political rights, yes, you freed yourself from colonial rule now. But now begins the real task. And the real task is you want to produce a nation where people have a certain measure of freedom, equality, so forth and so on. Right? How do we achieve that? So this is now what we are interested in. Before we address some of the details, I want to look at this idea of what is called development. Okay? Because that's what it's all about, right? That's the story of the nation state. It's a story of development. Right? So what is development? Someone care to tell me what you understand by development? Yes?
It's the improvement of living standards over a period of time with regard to statistics like infant mortality, education, literacy, so on and so forth.
Okay. So it's the improvement of a people over a period of time. And how do you judge that improvement? You judge it by various kinds of indices, most of which are mentioned in the United Nations Human Development Report, right? Such as infant mortality rate, maternal mortality rate, what percentage of the population is literate, right? How many hospital beds are there for every 100,000 people? What percentage of the population has access to water, electricity, housing, clothing, so forth and so on. I don't think actually, by the way, the UN Development Reports uses clothing, but they would use electrification, water, certainly, housing. These are important indices. Of course, there are a great many other indices as well. What percentage of because being, by the way, literacy and going to school are not necessarily the same thing. You can actually become literate without going to school, right? Yes?
I would also add that perhaps development can be seen in terms of geopolitics as a rebuilding nation state to raise its GDP and contribute to the global economy.
Okay. You could say integration into the global economy, but this is, I think, something that we've become more aware of, let's say, in the last 20, 30 years. All right? I think it would be safe to say that most countries that became free in Asia and Africa in the 1940s, 50s, they were not really thinking simply of integration into the global economy. In fact, I think that that was a rather distant object for some of them. They were simply thinking of more along the lines of what Sunny had mentioned here, and that would be the improvement of the people, right? And how do you judge that? Well, you judge it by looking at, well, what percentage of the people now have access to water and electricity and all of that. And I need not tell you, by the way, if you heard Sainath and if you've done the Dres Sen reading, that India has failed miserably, miserably on virtually all of these counts. There's just no question about it, right? Because you look at education being probably the best example of that in most countries of the world where the state had decided that education was going to be a priority. And how do you judge it's going to be a priority? For example, what percentage of the budget is allocated to education? That's one of the things that you would use, right? I mean, in Nicaragua and Cuba, I know that Cuba is not a well-liked country in America, but Cuba has a 99% literacy rate. And one of the reasons it has a very high literacy rate is because the communist state there decided early on that it was going to, in fact, actually initiate a massive program of education. And that's exactly what they did in Nicaragua. And that's what they're trying to do slowly in China now. Right? And India's record there, frankly, is abysmal. Right? So if you had to judge India as a democracy there, then you would have to say, well, it's actually failed miserably. right? And one of the things they try to demonstrate, the Dresden sent there, is that in fact actually countries such as Bangladesh, which were worse off than India a few decades ago, they have done better, right? We're taking a country in proximity to India, same intellectual, cultural milieu, social milieu as India, and we're saying that Bangladesh, in fact, has actually done better for various reasons. Okay, but without getting into all of that, I want to return to the question of development, because we don't have what I would call a political understanding of development so far, right? So we've been given two explanations. So let me put it to you this way: when we say development, we also mean clearly that we have in mind the model of some country or group of countries that are already developed, right? Improvement, because so it was said improvement of a people. All right, so improvement to what standard, and what does that mean? What does that mean? So let's say, for example, let me take an illustration for a second, and think of it this way: think of a ladder, right? And in this ladder, you climb up the steps. So there are countries here which are underdeveloped at the bottom of the ladder. And then there's the bottom of the bottom. So they are the failed states, as they're called in America, right? So failed states would be, Sudan would be an example of a failed state. Okay, so we won't get into the politics of why certain countries are called failed states, but they have failed their people as well. That's one of the implications. Afghanistan would be another illustration of that. So if you look at the UN Development Human Report, Afghanistan, Sudan, South Sudan, a new country, right, that came into being just a few years ago, these are at the very bottom of the UN Human Development Index. Okay? Then you have what are called the developing countries. And within this group, there are a group of countries called the emerging powers. Sometimes they're also known as the BRICS, right? So the BRICS states. So BRICS includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, right? And so on. And then you have, of course, so these are developed countries, and then there are what you might call the developed countries. Okay? And then some of them might be, quote, overdeveloped, because they're overdeveloped in some respects and underdeveloped in others. I mean, I'll give you a very simple illustration of some of the complexities of this. Japan, in the year 2012, had how many homicides do you think caused by guns? Anybody wants to take a, yeah?
I would say maybe 10.
Fantastic guess. 12. All of Japan had 12 homicides on account of guns. How many did the United States have in 2012? 20,000. A bit of an understatement. More like 25,000. Okay? And you know, I mentioned it to someone, they said, oh yeah, but the United States has a population that's vastly bigger. No, it's not vastly bigger. It's a ratio of 3 to 1 at best. I mean, Japan is not 5 million or 10 million. You're talking about 100 million plus. Easily. Okay? So even if we said, let's just say, so we are 10, so it was actually 12 times 3, so that we have the same ratio, 36 homicides, if Japan had the same population as the United States did, roughly, as opposed to 25,000. Okay? So should we call both of them developed? I might have some reservations about that, because I think, you know, I would call the U.S. extremely underdeveloped, at least with respect to this question, right? That there are countries where they're very clear that they know how to avoid mass murder on the streets. You know, you don't need to drop bombs in America because there are enough people dying anyhow, without somebody dropping bombs or napalm or whatever it is that the U.S. likes to drop in other countries. There are enough people dying here anyhow, so why bother, you know? Right? Okay, so those are the ratios we're talking about over here. But we haven't gotten to the real gist of the real problem with the ideology of development. What is that problem, possibly? And what kind of category is development, by the way? Is it a spatial category? Is it a temporal category? What kind of category is it? When we say the developed world, what do we have in mind? What countries would come into that? The United States, most of Europe, certainly Western Europe, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Japan, right? A few other countries here and there, right? And then when we say the underdeveloped world, right, what do we have in mind? We have in mind virtually all of Africa and some of Asia, certainly all of South Asia, and this country called Haiti, which is in the Caribbean, right? Part of the Americas, but yeah, that's part of that. So it appears to be a geographical, a spatial category, but it's not. It's not. It's a temporal category. What does temporal mean? Having to do with time. Now, what does that mean? What that means is very simply the following. The whole ambition of the ideology of development is, let's first look at it in innocent terms. Innocent terms are the terms that have been suggested that it's improvement. And at one level, entirely correct. That you want to make sure that a greater number of people over a period of time begin to have access to safe water, electricity, medical care, education, etc. Right? But here's the political reading of development now. And we'll begin to see that perhaps it's not as innocent as it looks. Right? Because if you're here and you're underdeveloped and you have to climb the ladder, because what is it that the people of India have to do? What is their history? What is the project? The project is they must continue to climb the ladder until they get to where the developed world is. However, there's one problem here. The problem is the people at the top here, are they just going to continue to stay where they are? They're going to move somewhere. Right? They don't even want to be on the ladder anymore. They want to be on Mars. Right? You don't want to be on the ladder. You want to be doing something else. In other words, you see, if the ambition is that all the people who are at the bottom, that they should be gradually climbing their way up to the top. Right? The only thing is that you are always playing a game of catch-up. That's what you're doing. I mean, that's the history of China and India in the last 25 years. And the people who are going to applaud what's happening in China and say, oh, isn't it wonderful? Well, maybe not entirely, because what you have to think about is, of course, a great many geopolitical issues, such as the fact that, well, yes, if 500 million Chinese enter into the middle class, and if 500 million Indians additionally enter into the middle class, well, how are we going to sustain a standard of living that is middle class for everybody around the world? It's not possible. It simply isn't possible. There isn't an economist in the world who can actually show that it's possible to sustain the kind of living that Americans enjoy if most of China and most of India now became part of the middle class. Of course, the only way you can do anything about it is if people at the top say, well, we might have to lower our standard of living. Of course, no one wants to hear that at all. But you may have to do that. That may be the only way. And that's why Gandhi used to say in 1930, he said, if it took a small island country such as England to strip the world bare, which is what England did, it exploited 40 countries. If it had to strip the world bare to feed, clothe, and give its people a certain standard of living, and how many people are we talking about? We're talking about 20, 30 million at most. Imagine what India would have to do if it wanted to give all of its people that same standard of living. And imagine what would happen if all the Chinese entered into the middle class as well. Right? So we've got a number of fundamental problems here. One problem here, of course, has to do with the fact that my destiny as an Indian, if I were to accept the ideology of development, is that I should not be living my own history. I should be living someone else's idea of what is a good life. That's my only destiny. You see, according to the whole ideology of development, which has been the fundamental ideology of the second half of the 20th century, that all those people who are underdeveloped, their only task in life is to become like the Americans, right? That is, enjoy the same standard of living, be part of the middle class, and have the same gross abusive levels of consumption. Right? That's your only destiny, is to become like that. That's what the ideology of development is, fundamentally. Yes, of course, we can clothe it with very nice things by saying that, well, no, it's much more modest. It's simply an attempt to give people, safe water. Good, safe drinking water. No, it's not just that. Because you don't need a whole apparatus of development, which is what has been developed. The World Bank, the IMF, thousands of institutions and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of NGOs all working towards development. And that's one of the reasons why you read Arundhati Roy. Because one of the things we don't want to recognize is that when states implement projects of development, they're going to people who are going to fall by the wayside like mosquitoes. And frankly, the states don't care. They don't care. 1958 to 1962, for those of you who have studied Chinese history at all, what happened between 1958 and 62? Does anybody know? Sorry? In economic terms, what else happened? Do you know?
There was a famine.
Famine. And how many people died? 30 million. 30. 30 million people died. And it's not that the Chinese state did not know. They knew what was happening. There were dozens, hundreds of reports being sent to the Central Party headquarters. Dozens, hundreds every day. People are falling like mosquitoes. And the response of the party headquarters was, let them fall. We need a reduction of population. This is a wonderful way to achieve a reduction of population, other than having a one-child policy, right? If people are dying by the thousands and hundreds of thousands because we have to develop, when we have to develop, some people must be willing to play the role of the sacrificial lamb. That's exactly what happened. There's really no way to twist the story to produce some good moral out of it, That's the ideology of development. That is what Arundhati Roy is saying. That when you have this policy, there are people who are going to be sacrificed. And for what? Right? And that's why we need a critique. And it's very hard to do a critique of development that persuades people. Why? Because this is such an innocent word. For example, you have a child. What do you wish to see? You wish to see your child develop. I would hope so, unless some people want their child to become retarded, right? And one way to become retarded is to accept the ideology of development. That's what's happened to India and to most countries in Africa. Okay? But you see, the word development has this innocence about it. That's what Sainath is talking about too. What are these sharpening inequalities that he's talking about? The data that you have, right? Data produced not by him or by me, produced by the Indian state, that 80% of the population of India, when they last did a massive survey, carried national sample survey statistics, 80% of the population of India was living on less than $1 a day. So what have 70 years of development done? Right? That's the question. And I'm suggesting to you that before we rush headlong into saying, well, we just need development, because all the programs of study you have at UCLA in the social sciences, they're all geared towards development. That's what they're all geared towards in the social sciences. What an economics department is all about development and growth. So before we rush headlong into it, what we're saying is, you're here at the bottom. The whole ideology of development is you must continue to develop until you reach the top here. And of course, I'm pointing out there are a number of problems. The people at the top are not just going to be sitting around doing nothing. Right? They're moving up further. And that means that you now have a game where you continue to try to catch up, and you can never really do that. Because one of the things we have to understand is the circumstances under which countries in the West became developed. Right? And it had an explicit relationship with colonial exploitation. There's no question about that. In the 18th century, 19th century, there's a fundamental relationship between the rise of the West and what you would describe as colonial exploitation. Now, we don't have mass resources available anywhere that you can just strip the world bare and hope that China and India will continue to do that and become imperialist powers. Right? So this is, and I'm saying in philosophical terms, the problem also is that it means that the people at the bottom, in Africa, in India, Pakistan, Somalia, wherever, they don't have their own history anymore. Your only task in life is to now live out someone else's history, to get to something which has been defined as a good thing. Okay? So, in concrete terms now, in different terms now, let's look at it, the story, in a more conventional way now. Right? The conventional way is what basically Dres and Sen have done, and what some of the others have done, albeit they've done it in a good way. Right? The conventional way is to say, well, let's look at all of these indices and see how India has done. But before we get into that, we might also want to consider, so what was the economic policy of India after 1947? In order to determine its economic policy, it constituted a group called the Planning Commission. Okay? That's what the Planning Commission there refers to. What was the model that they used? It was not the American model, because you don't have a Planning Commission in the United States. Soviet Russia, the Soviet Union had something that was equivalent to what you would call a Planning Commission. And what does a Planning Commission do? It has what are called 5-year plans. What do the 5-year plans do? They set targets. Okay? But I want to be sure that you understand that this is not identical to the Soviet model. Let me give you one huge difference between the Indian model and the Soviet model. One huge difference was that in the Soviet model, these plans also included the collectivization of agriculture, as it's called. The collectivization of agriculture, which means that you eliminate the small farms, you consolidate farms into bigger farms, because it's easier to mechanize farming when you have bigger farms. For example, if you're going to use tractors for farming, right? If you want to use tractors for farming, and if you have a plot of land which is the size of this room, well, you can't really make effective use of it. Of course, there was an ideological component. The ideological component was that communism came along with the doctrine that private property is to be abolished. It's to be abolished. Except for, of course, the private property of all the officials of the state. All of them had magnificent private properties. We need not worry about that, you know. But private property was to be abolished. Right? So the collectivization, and it is the collectivization of agriculture, the kulaks and all of that, which led to massive exploitation, to mass murder. There's no other phrase for it except mass murder. That's what it was in the Soviet Union for a very substantial period of time. Now, I don't think we had anything like mass murder in that way. We just had slow murder, maybe, in India, but we certainly did not have mass, rapid murder as you did in the Soviet Union, where, you know, people were just killed in very large numbers. And of course, you had a whole system of gulags, right? These camps, labor camps, so forth and so on. In India, you didn't have any labor camps. No. There was no mission to send people to labor camps where they would get a re-education, as it's known, right? So something that they had in China too for a while, and something, of course, that they've had in North Korea, so forth and so on. Right? You don't have anything like that. And I think there are many reasons why India didn't go that way. Partly it had to do with the nature of the democratic struggle. Partly it had to do with the fact that the democratic struggle in India was orchestrated by people such as Gandhi, who were clearly of a completely different sensibility. that whatever differences one might have with Gandhi about various kinds of things, that Gandhi certainly represented an extraordinarily democratic kind of sentiment. But you did have state planning. The reason you had state planning is because people like Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, and the people that he appointed to the Planning Commission were firmly of the view that India was so far behind the rest of the world that it basically had lost the ability to manufacture anything. And in some ways, frankly, it's not incorrect. Because I told you, for example, what the life expectancy was in India, okay, in 1941. That's the last census before independence. The census is conducted every 10 years. Right? So the last census before independence was 1941, and life expectancy in India was less than 30 at that time. And India's ability to manufacture goods had greatly diminished over the course of the last 200 years. So the view of people like Nehru and the state planners was that India needed to actually have centralized state planning, right? That the free market ideology wouldn't really work in India, at least not at this juncture. And what they did was something that was a combination, you might say. Combination in the sense that you allow room for entrepreneurship, okay? You allow room for individual ownership of property, all of that, okay? But on the other hand, you turn over certain enterprises to the state. So you create huge companies such as BHEL. BHEL is an acronym, just giving you an illustration here. Bharat Heavy Electronics Limited. Okay? Bharat is the word in India for India. So Bharat Heavy Electronics Limited. That would be an illustration of essentially a company that is a state-owned company. Okay? And so things like steel production, right? Automobile production. That's not a very good example because India didn't really have too many automobiles. It barely had any roads. So what are you going to have automobiles for, frankly, in 1947, to be quite honest? Right? But one could give illustrations of that kind. Aeronautics. Okay, Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, HAL, as it was called. Okay, that would be another illustration of a state-owned company. So you turn over all of these things to the state, and then you allow individual property ownership, entrepreneurship, small-scale industries, all of that. Okay, so it's a combination of the two. And what does the Planning Commission do? It also sets targets. What do I mean when I say targets? A random example, that right now India is producing, 10 million tons of sugar. The target is at the end of that 5th year, it's a 5-year plan. Then at the end of those 5 years, you review your targets and then set new targets, and then you have a new 5-year plan, correct? Okay, that's how it works effectively. So at the end of that 5 year, you say the target is sugar production should be 50 million tons. Right now it's 10, it should be 50. If steel production is 200 million tons, it should be 800. Whatever the target you have set. So you set targets for all of these things. Okay, that's what the Planning Commission was going to do, and that's what those 5-year plans refer to. Now, when I talk about projects of the state, what I mean by that is that big dams, for example, those are projects of the state. You know, big dams cannot be undertaken by individuals or individual companies even. And even in the United States, I mean, in the 1930s, what would be the best example of a huge
Hoover Dam.
Hoover?
And it was a consortium of 5 different corporations that could actually build it.
Yeah, okay. But what about the Tennessee Valley Authority, for example, right? Okay. If you look at the major projects, right, you're going to find a substantial amount of state development, involvement. The best example of that is what? The interstate system in this country. Massive system. It was not done by a company. It's done by the state. It's done by the state. Okay? So even in a country with free market enterprise, there are certain things that are obviously left with the state. Or there's going to be enormous state jurisdiction and supervision. A very good example of that would be obviously the armaments industry. It's mainly private companies, of course, that are involved in that, almost all of it. But there's obviously enormous state intervention and supervision over these aspects. So in India, essentially, the impulse was that when I talk about projects of the state, so for example, you want to build a dam or a series of dams, which is more often the case, right, in order to be able to produce electricity. So these are hydroelectric projects. The Bhakra Nangal Dam project is a good illustration of that. So massive project, and it is going to be a project of the state. Jawaharlal Nehru, I mean, this is a cliche. You're going to find it in every book, but it's a useful cliche. Okay, so Bhakra Nangal, just writing the name of this particular dam project. Jawaharlal Nehru said that these would be the temples of New India. We had enough temples already in India. Okay, I mean, one town called Ayodhya alone has over 10,000 temples. Okay, but these would be the new temples. These, the shining dams, the big industries. And one of the reasons why people like Nehru and the state planners were committed to this centralized state planning, which was then turned over to the Planning Commission. Okay? They were committed to that because the view was that India was so far behind the developed countries of the West that it needed some degree of aggressive organization, and that in a country where even free enterprise had barely developed under colonial rule, only the state had the capacity to carry out projects of this kind. Okay? So these would become the projects of the state. And the reason why I had you read the Arundhati piece is because the best sign of that, in part why I had you read that piece, was the best symbol of that was the dams, the huge dams that were going to come up. Okay, so this is what I mean when I speak about projects of the state. All right, now, what were some of the other ramifications of the kind of policy that India had? And I want to just give you a little anecdote, because that will make it a little bit more clear what I mean when I speak about the conditions under which one was growing up in a country such as India. So when I was growing up in India in the 1960s and moving into the early 1970s, I can remember distinctly, and remember, I come from what you would describe as a middle class household. So conditions for us were less difficult, much less difficult than they would be for people in the countryside, or even the slum populations, the working class populations of urban areas. Right? I'm not coming from the top 5%, but I'm coming from the middle class. And what were the conditions that we're talking about? The conditions I'm talking about were that you had to stand in line often in order to get milk. You might have to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning. The enormous shortages in such things as milk, dairy products, soap, kerosene oil, so forth and so on. Now, one of the things that the Indian government did was they introduced what were called ration shops. Okay? Ration shops. So you know the word ration, right? As in rationing, right? So military rations. Every person is given a certain amount. So in times of famine, you might have a rationing policy. That there might be a policy where the state says that nobody can actually go to a store and buy more than 8 ounces of sugar or 4 ounces of butter. That's the most that you can buy. And on the other hand, it means that everyone will be given 2 ounces of butter free, or at a highly regulated price. So these ration shops, fair price shops as they were also known as, okay, and in the dress and reading, they use a different acronym now because it's now known as a public distribution system. So when they refer to that, that's what they're referring to. So what does that mean, the public distribution system? That if you belong to a certain strata of society in India, that is that you fall either below the poverty line or even if you're marginally above it. So there's what's called BPL in India. Remember I told you that you cannot study India without acronyms. Okay? So when you see BPL in Dres Sen, it means below poverty line. Okay? And APL is above poverty line. All of which is meaningless in some ways, because what they do is they just shift the poverty line. So if they want to show that they've made great progress, you just move the poverty line. That's all, you know, right? I mean, it's what Sainath had mentioned in his evening lecture the other day, for the 3 or 4 of you were there, that in certain states they had 15,000 farmers who committed suicide, and then the next year 0. Well, how did that happen? Right? Well, because you simply changed your definition, for example, of who a farmer is. I mean, if there are no farmers, they obviously can't be committing suicide. Right? As simple as that, right? Sounds daft, and you think, who's going to get away with it? But yeah, but the state of Chhattisgarh over the last 2 years, their returns show 0, right? For the number of farmers who committed suicide, and 2 years ago, 15,000. So, sir, either the farmers have all become enlightened, or they've all won a lottery somehow. Right? So that's what this PEL is, poverty line. Yeah, you just shift it. If things are looking really bad, you know, it shows that the state's development projects have really failed. Well, you just shift the poverty line, and this way we can show that, 20% of the people actually were able to lift themselves out of poverty. Right? So now, what are the ration shop? What does rationing and public distribution system mean? It means that if you are BPL, a member of the BPL class, or even above it in some cases, okay, you are all entitled to go to a shop and get a certain amount of things at a highly subsidized price. So if the free market price for a kilogram of rice is, let's say, 50 rupees a kilo, okay, at the ration shop, you going there, and of course I can't go there, because that would be criminal for me to go there, because I can obviously afford to buy the best rice from a free market shop. But of course people are going to try to beat the system, right? We know that. But how do you prove that you can? So if you've been issued a BPL card, then that entitles you to get a ration card. Then you take that ration card to this fair price shop in the public distribution system, and depending on how many members there are in your family, then they'll say, okay, you're entitled to 10 kilograms of rice, and each of these is going to be only 3 rupees a kilo, or 4 rupees a kilo. And you're entitled to, so there were 3 or 4 things that you were entitled to. You were entitled to kerosene oil, because that you would use that for various purposes, okay, and you were entitled to sugar, okay, the Indians can't have their tea without sugar, okay, sugar and wheat, okay, few things, few essentials, rice, and that's what you get at your ration shop. So now what we're talking about is that even people of my class in the 60s, we had ration cards. Because frankly, it didn't mean anything to be middle class at all in India at that time. It meant almost nothing. Because there were people who were at the bottom, and then there were people at the top, and you really didn't have much of a so-called middle class. And when I'm describing to you the conditions there, we're talking about the fact that if you went overseas, as I did, and then came back to India, every time you came back to India, there was a massive duty on every imported thing that you brought into the country. So if you brought a bottle of shampoo, you had to pay a duty. And the duty could run to 200% for some things, 200%. Every imported thing. So you brought in 10 CDs, okay, well there were no CDs in those times, there were audio cassettes, okay. You brought in 10 audio cassettes, and you told them that, well look, you've only come for 20 days and you're leaving the country. So they would then enter in your passport 20 audio cassettes. And then when you left the country, they would check that you had the 20 audio cassettes with you when you left. That's what we're talking about. Okay? Those were the conditions. And those were the conditions for the middle class. We're not talking about people who are living at the margins of Indian society. So in concrete terms now, we're saying At the macro level, all right, you've got the planning commission, you've got the 5-year plans, you've got the projects of the state, right? This is the ideology, and there's some significant differences that we have to think about with the Soviet Union. And it also needs to be said that something I'd mentioned before, and now is the time to reiterate it before I give you in more academic terms what import substitution policies really meant. It needs to be said that in India, you had problems, obviously, with food production, but you did not have famines. You did not have famines. And you did have famines continuously in the 200 years of colonial rule. There were people who surely in the post-47 period were not getting enough to eat. Malnutrition is still very high in India. Half the population of India suffers from malnutrition. Okay, and then there are different degrees of malnutrition, because there are some degrees of malnutrition from which you cannot recover. If you've been malnutrition from infancy over a period of time, it's going to be almost impossible to recover over a period of time. So it depends on how quickly you arrest the problem. All right? And this is one of the reasons why in the lower classes and among the poor and in the working classes, it seems that, hey, some of these people are dim-witted. Well, it's not like they're born dim-witted, but malnutrition over a period of time can have severe consequences. Okay? But having said that, it is also very clear that India did not have any famines. And one of the reasons it didn't have any famines is because there was, to some extent, a system of accountability. Right? And this is the argument that Sen had made in his major work on famines, work that goes back decades, where he showed that, in fact, a democracy has never had a famine. And that is entirely correct. The famines that took place in Ireland you have to remember that the Irish were colonized by the English, the Great Potato Famine of the middle part of the 19th century. But Ireland is a colony. Okay, so food production might be, you could argue, one of the arenas of economic activity in which India was now, over a period of time, going to do very well. Now, many people will even question that. And once in a while, India makes a great show of generosity. How? That, if you have shortages of food in Tajikistan or someplace, India will say, well, we'll give you 10 million tons of rice free, right? Because, of course, it shows that India has got some economic prowess. But how do you do that when half of your country is malnutritioned? Worthwhile asking, right? So there is food politics. There's always food politics. And the United States was the largest exporter of wheat to India in the 1960s. By far the largest exporter. But the quality of wheat that was sent from here was actually relatively poor. There were lots of complaints in India about that. That yes, the US was sending wheat, okay, and sending it at highly subsidized prices. And this is where it becomes so interesting. I mean, you would think, what is the relationship of, for example, the whole apparatus of knowledge that you have in the US about India? Well, the Indian government paid the American government in rupees. And so the Americans had these billions and billions of rupees, but the rupee, as you know, is a non-convertible currency. What are they going to do with all these billions of rupees? Right? So what did they do? The Library of Congress set up an office in India. And they said, we're going to buy 40 copies of every book published in India. We're going to send them to libraries here in America. And then the India studies programs began to develop in the United States. Look at the interesting ways in which things, right, develop. So here we're now talking about a situation where I'm saying that food production, for example, India did relatively well. And then, of course, you're going to have the Green Revolution in the 1960s, right? Going to lead to even more accelerated production at that point in time. We're going to look at the Green Revolution separately when we look at the Punjab in part, because we're going to try to see what were some of the consequences of the Green Revolution. But certainly, India is going to try to achieve, and in some respects you could say, that is, if you don't take into account the people who are suffering from malnutrition, right, India was going to be able to achieve self-sufficiency in food. Right? That might have been one of the, relatively speaking, one of the major gains on the economic front in India. However, with respect to most things, what India pursued were what are called these import substitution policies. Are there any economics majors here in this? So do you know what import substitution policy is, Sunny? Never heard of it? Did any of the other economics majors? Yeah, I mean, somebody else raise their hand. Yeah, you haven't studied import substitution policies. Okay, so import substitution policies basically are that you give subsidies to vital industries. Okay, so in other words, look at it this way, very simple. That rather than importing, all right, now there's some things that you can import and you say it doesn't really matter. So, you know, if I have to import hand lotion and shampoo and conditioner, well, frankly, these are not really vital industries. On the other hand, there are certain industries that are vital. Among them, for example, you could say are pharmaceuticals, right? Pharmaceuticals, drugs. And you know that India, for example, today is one of the largest producers of drugs in the world. When you go to Rite Aid or CVS or whatever, you know, a good portion of the time, the pills that you are buying, okay, your amoxicillin or whatever it is, it's made in India and made at a fraction of the cost that it's made at over here. And there have been immense disputes, by the way, because you know, the WTO rules, the WTO is a World Trade Organization, WTO rules are making it very difficult for countries like India. So the HIV cocktail of drugs, as it's called, India is providing a huge portion of the world with this. And it's very cheap. If you've ever wondered why the price has come down from what it used to be to what it is now for an HIV patient, it's partly because of the production of these drugs in countries such as India. And India has adamantly taken the position that for some kinds of drugs, it's not going to be subjected to WTO rules because it's crucial that people, including people in its own country, should be able to receive these drugs at highly subsidized prices. Okay? So when we say vital industries, we are talking about, I mean, just giving you one illustration there, but the other illustration obviously would be defense. Right? Most defense-related would be mainly vital industries. But there India's record is quite poor because India has not done really well in terms of becoming self-reliant in the armaments industry. It's all of its fighter aircraft, they're all basically coming from abroad. Okay, or the larger portion of all the things that you need in order to assemble an aircraft, a larger portion of those materials and goods are coming from abroad. And then there might be a certain Indian component. So one of the things that you might want to do in this policy is you increase the element of indigenization. All right? So if let's say 90% of all the parts that you need in order to assemble a tank are coming from abroad, the intention of the planners, the economic planners, was that with every passing year, you decrease your reliance upon these foreign manufacturers. So that within 10 years, you say that only 50% of the parts that are needed in order to assemble a tank or a fighter aircraft are going to come from abroad. Okay? Yes?
So you talked about education and, particularly, for example, aircraft. How come, I don't know, has India invested heavily in education, at least in terms of for engineering, for self-sufficiency?
No, not really, no. But can we just table that? I'm interested in the question, but I would have to address the question of education, which I will. Okay, looking both at primary education and higher education, because one of the fundamental differences between India and, let's say, countries which have taken seriously the objective of 100% literacy, one of the fundamental differences not simply the percentage of your GDP that is being committed to education, it's also what percentage of that is committed to primary education and what percentage is being committed to higher education, for example, to universities. Okay? So, but that's something that we're going to have to just table aside, because I may not get to it today, but as I said, I will continue this discussion in my next lecture for at least 20-25 minutes. All right? So now in the import substitution policy we're talking about, we are saying that it meant A, nationalization, implicitly nationalization of certain kinds of industries. B, subsidies to vital industries. Okay? You give subsidies, and you give subsidies because in vital industries especially, you do not want to make yourself reliant upon someone else, because you become hostage to the other country or other group of countries if you happen to be getting your parts, materials from a number of countries. Okay? Number 3, increased taxation. Increased taxation. Okay? And number 4, which is again related to that, highly protectionist state policies. Right? Highly protectionist. So you protect your own industries, and one of the ways you protect your own industries is you put high tariffs on imported goods. Right? High tariffs. What is the incentive for an Indian company to be able to come up with good shampoo? Right? I keep on using the example of shampoo partially because shampooing was invented in India, by the way. You know, not widely known, but it was. All right? So what is the incentive for an Indian company to produce good shampoos if you can get really good shampoos from overseas at very little price? Very little price. Right? A simple example. So what this is what it means to be protectionist. Then you say that, well, that's a reason why you put a 200% from their point of view. Of course, it also gives the state revenues, but you put 200% customs duty when you bring in a bottle of shampoo with you, right? Which was quite common throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, before the economic reforms, which are last on this list over here, of 1990, roughly around 1990, 91. Okay, so before we get to 1991, very briefly, let me recapitulate. What we're saying is that you had state planning, you had emphasis on heavy industries, on things like dams, for example, on steel mills, many of them built in collaboration with foreign countries. And going to the subject of higher education, this is where collaboration comes in. One of the things that they did in India is they set up what are called the IITs, the Indian Institutes of Technology. Okay? More than 50% of the graduates of the IITs, since they were set up, came to the United States. They did their undergraduate degrees in India, and then they went on. A lot of these startups, Silicon Valley startups, you should look at the background of these people. Okay? The IITs were intended to be first-rate institutions where you would get an education at the cost of nothing. The state would provide the education. And the IITs that were set up, initially the 5 IITs that were set up, each of them was set up in collaboration with a different country. Right? Because again, you didn't want to make yourself wholly dependent or reliant upon someone else. So one was set up in collaboration with the Americans, one in collaboration with the Soviets, Britain, and so on. Right? That's what they did. They set up these IITs, Indian Institutes of Technology, and these Indian Institutes of Technology were intended to produce graduates who would then, of course, go on to work with, you know, Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, etc., etc. What happened, of course, is that half of them eventually fled to the US, where the prospects were better. Okay? So in this period, 47 onwards, through the 1980s, growth rate was relatively small but steady. Small but steady, 3-4% constantly. Okay? And then if we're looking at these indices, which we haven't looked at in detail, but I mentioned them, you know, access to education, so forth and so on, it's incremental. It's, yes, literacy rate goes up, undoubtedly in India, okay, but it goes up rather slowly in comparison to, let's say, places such as Nicaragua or Cuba after their revolutions, where the literacy rates shot up within 5 years dramatically. In India, nothing of that kind happened at all. It is also worthwhile making the point here that we are speaking so far of India in totality, but that the differences within India, which Sen and Dres are very careful to identify, that the differences within India are enormous. Enormous. So you have, if this is the map of India here, you know, and this is a state of Kerala over here, literacy rates of well over 90%. Well over 90%. 94, 95, in some districts of Kerala, 99%, full literacy. Okay? Kerala is also, by the way, one of the states that for long was governed by the communists. Now, of course, the communists would like to take all the credit. And this is where the story is complicated. It's complicated because the state of Kerala was put together by joining three different parts. Okay? Three different parts. Cochin, Malabar, and Travancore. And in two of those three parts, education under the native princes, because they used to be native states, education was a big priority. In other words, what am I saying? I'm saying that Kerala was already, quote, relatively well developed, according to the conventional criteria. Relatively well developed before 1947. But I think by the same token, it must be said that one of the reasons why Kerala was able to achieve this literacy of 99% in many of its districts, and as I said, well over 90% for the state as a whole, is undoubtedly because of the reforms initiated by the Communist Party. That they simply decided that they were going to do it, and they achieved massive land reform. Everyone in Kerala owns at least some property. With a stroke of the pen, literally, they just demolished the old propertied classes. Okay? We'll get to that later on. I'm describing to you the differences within India, because there's a hazard in speaking of India in totality as a whole. Because if this part of India has 95% literacy plus, okay, as a whole, then you get to Rajasthan over here, and you get to Chhattisgarh over here. And there are some districts of Rajasthan where female literacy is 5%. 5% today. And there are some parts of the tribal belt, that's why we're taking Chhattisgarh here, where literacy, female literacy is 3 to 4% today in 2014. Right, so the separation is enormous between Kerala and there. And that's a risk that we're always taking when we're speaking of India as a single entity. Okay? Now, I don't have time to get into the rest right now. I will get into it. So the agenda, I will get into it next week. The agenda for next week is we look at the economic reforms of 1990 down to the present day very briefly. What are their implications? Some of which have been addressed, for example, by Sainath, and even in the presentation he did here, when towards the end, in response to someone, he talked about the sharpening, inequalities, okay, in India, the growing inequality in India. That's certainly one of the implications of this. But we're going to look at what we mean when we talk about the growth of the middle class, right? And finally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at one or two sectors in slightly greater detail. One of them will be education. Education, the question of gender, equality, and food. Those would be the three that I'm going to look at in some detail. So that'll be about half an hour on Tuesday. Okay?